Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 17 cheat sheet. If you haven't watched the cheat sheet series before, it's effectively an FPL series where I go through all the price points for all the positions and tier assets based on underlying stats, their future fixture runs, and what we know so far based on what managers have said in terms of press conferences and of course things that we can imply from watching certain players on the pitch. As far as the midfield position, we just quickly start off there. Not too many changes in this position outside of that 5.x price bracket. I do think because of the changing expectations in some of the teams that we've seen so far, mostly within Fulham and Bournemouth and Everton, these three teams definitely rising within our expectations. Certain assets, of course, have, for example, been added to the game on top of some of the other picks that we've previously recommended. Willian, for example, was someone that I recommended in this price bracket here last week, and really good to see that he scored a goal. But we also know that he got subbed off at halftime, so I think that puts a little bit of doubt into Willian. But at the same time, that for example could foster Andreas being a better pick, right? Because Andreas usually should be the penalty taker if Willian doesn't take penalties, although maybe with Raul Jimenez doing extremely well in terms of form, actually finding his way back to goal scoring, who knows? Maybe penalties could actually be bestowed back towards him because he obviously is a previously good career penalty taker. So I do think Andreas is good just because the underlying stats are actually rather good for the Premier League. He actually has more expected assists per 90 than someone like Willian. So of course you're looking at Andreas as more of a creative player, and that's normal because of course he's on a lot of set pieces as well for this team. As far as Doucouré, he's been added because he's effectively the opposite of Andreas, right? We know he's not on penalties, but of course the expected goals have been incredible for Doucouré playing as a second striker. I previously didn't recommend him because I thought Everton had some pretty tough fixtures, and the reality is that their fixtures are still quite tough, but I think it's also worth recognizing that Everton really are a very, very good team right now. Definitely top half in terms of our expectations and understanding of things. And so for that reason, I do think that Doucouré, justifiably does deserve a rise. And so Doucouré here, now that he's actually had maybe around half a season worth of games, close to that at least, and that gives us the comfort of saying that that change in position that Dyke has installed for Doucouré has actually had a huge benefit in terms of his attacking stats, and that we no longer need to jump the gun. I think he's just a good pick. As far as Tavernier, same sort of situation here where because Bournemouth have obviously increasingly looked like a much more competent attack, he's actually someone who of course plays within that technically attacking floor for this Bournemouth team, and so his minutes being relatively secure as well just means that in my opinion he's actually a good pick going forwards. He's a bit more balanced in terms of sort of being split between expected goals and expected assists. But as I said, as a Bournemouth attacker right now, considering that Bournemouth are actually a pretty competent team and his underlying stats are pretty healthy, I do think that given that Bournemouth actually have 3 good games off the back, he actually is a very interesting differential as well. Now, Hee-Chan is at the same price bracket simply because, as I said, there's a lot of issues with Hee-Chan outside of him being a penalty taker, right? Simply, you're just looking at Asian Cup and also 4 yellow cards, which is why, of course, he's no longer a green asset. As far as, let's say, Gordon and Kudus, I do think I have to drop Kudus simply because, as I've been saying so far, West Ham are a team that are very poor, but also we saw Kudus get an early substitution, so I think his minutes are also, not 100% nailed. And also at this sort of price point, given that West Ham are such a poor team, and you actually have all these other picks from Fulham, from Bournemouth, from Everton, who are much cheaper and actually boast similar or better underlying stats compared to an asset option like Kudus, I just think that he has to fall for that reason. And West Ham, they continue to, for example, fail to live up to our expectations, even though Wolves at home is a very, very good fixture.
On Richarlison, I do think he's actually become one of the immediate sort of priority picks to sort of look at. And particularly if you're actually looking at a midfielder transfer this week, I think he's probably one of the go-to picks. The key thing here is Tottenham obviously are not involved in many other competitions compared to, let's say, someone like Gordon, who could occasionally, of course, play fewer minutes, for example, just like in the previous Tottenham game. However, with Charleston, it was really just a case of him building up match fitness after his surgery. And it was actually quite a big surprise for me to see him start actually this soon. So a bit of a shock in that case. And actually that just makes Richarlison even better as a pick. So I think he will get consistent starts. It might be left wing minutes. It might be centre forward minutes. And of course, he can obviously be prone to an early substitution. This is because when you watch, for example, Ange play, it's very likely that we see, for example, early substitutions. Lo Celso in the previous week, before the Newcastle game, was a very good example of that, where he gets subbed off at 65 minutes. For me, the key thing with Richarlison is actually, if you look at him as a bit of a long-term pick, actually going towards, for example, the Asian Cup and beyond, the key thing with Maddison's injury timeline is that I think Richarlison will actually become the penalty taker for a very short stint in FPL around game week 21 plus. And that makes him even more better as an asset, and I think an even more better hold, because I just see this Tottenham team continuing to, for example, persist in the way that they attack. Richarlison being a penalty taker is great. Obviously, his finishing isn't perfect, but you're still looking at a pick who actually plays for a very competent attacking team. And of course, he could very well play center forward or left wing for a lot of minutes. And that's going to be huge. So definitely Richarlison is one of my favorite picks this week.
As far as the 7.x assets, here we actually have not many changes whatsoever. The only change that I've really made is to drop Luis Diaz and Bowen. I just think that ultimately, once again, just sort of with my thoughts, these are sort of players where, given that the FPL assets at the 5.x position are so good, or even at the 6.x position, even when you consider, let's say, Gordon, for example, why do we have to justify spending funds on players who actually do not have the underlying stats to sort of marry up to those players, right? Why spend that sort of money? And I think with Foden, the difference in terms of the circumstances, of course, you have the clean sheet odds. You also have good fixtures in general, where if you, let's say, bench Foden in the blank game week, obviously because he's benched, other than that, the fixtures are very, very good for City. Whereas, for example, with players like Luis Diaz, Bowen, Martinelli, these are teams and also players who either have slightly poor fixtures coming up, or of course have underlying stats that are a little bit subpar. For example, with Bowen, we've been tracking his underlying stats from that very, very hot start that he had at the beginning of the season. And actually, of course, his underlying stats have gone down. And a lot of people think, for example, playing centre forward is very, very important for FPL. But that, of course, also has to depend on what sort of team you are, right? And I think Son is such a good example of that, where Son playing centre forward obviously did benefit quite a bit, but also you can see that he can also do incredibly well on the wings as well. And with Bowen, for example, someone who historically does operate with the wings, and I think still within, when you watch West Ham, he still will occupy, for example, more of like a right forward position right now. I just think that the clear weakness is West Ham overall as an attacking team. So he falls. Luis Diaz, for me, the concern, I suppose, is really Liverpool's worst fixtures. In terms of Fernandes, he's also suspended for this game. So my concern really with Fernandes is that he's not really worth owning as an asset until, let's say, Man United actually have a good fixture swing. So right now, of course, Saka and Son are the priorities. I still think, for example, the midfield template is something like Saka, Son, Mbumo, Gordon, Palmer, something like that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that, for example, players like Palmer, players like Gordon, or even Saka, for example, cannot be replaced with the 5.x options that we've actually added to the cheat sheet. I think those are very, very competent picks as well. Moving on to the other forward positions right now, we have Raul Jimenez as a new option. And of course, brilliant to see him actually go back to scoring ways. It's actually taken maybe upwards of maybe 2 years plus. But now that we're actually seeing this Fulham team actually click into gear and his minutes are actually very good, I think the biggest thing for him is actually being able to actually build enough fitness to actually be the consistent starter for Fulham. And so far, he's been able to do so, but playing at around 60 to 70 minutes, which is a very similar territory to where we often find Calvert-Lewin at, which is why, of course, I've added both Calvert-Lewin and Raul Jimenez. The big difference, of course, is Calvert-Lewin is a penalty taker. I'm not so sure about Raul Jimenez because Willian, of course, took some recent penalties, but who knows, if he's out, it might be the case that Andreas gets penalties, but it also might be the case that Raul could get penalties. As far as João Pedro and Cunha, these are both options where I think at that sort of price point, they're still good owns. And Cunha, of course, I think he will, for example, still benefit from, let's say, when Hwang actually goes to the Asian Cup, because Cunha will actually be the penalty taker of the team, presumably. So that's why I think Cunha is still worth keeping up here. And you can see, obviously, the preference that I have for penalty takers, but also given that their price point is actually very, very healthy, I think there's no issue really with having these players within our cheat sheet. As far as Solanke, Alvarez, and Watkins, you can see here that they're actually, for me, the green options in FPL right now, right? Because with Haaland potentially being out for Crystal Palace, which in my opinion seems to be 90 to 95% secure, we got news recently from FPL Focal, who's done some incredible investigative work, suggesting that Haaland's father and also some close friends have actually sold Haaland. And that makes me actually lean even more towards the direction that Haaland's injuries, somewhat severe, and that he actually needs that sort of rest. Not to mention that, of course, if the injury is related to stress and load, then load management needs to be applied. For example, if let's say Sheffield United is a fixture where Haaland could easily play, but he plays instead the Everton fixture, my concern really with Haaland in that example is maybe he could actually lose out in terms of the minutes in that Sheffield United fixture, which would also, for example, gut Haaland's potential as a great asset, right? So I do think Haaland has to fall. With Alvarez, of course, he's going to benefit from the inverse of that, but I do think that Alvarez has now become a bit more of a short-term punt because we have blank game week 18. He's going to be an incredible option when Haaland is out because that means that he's going to be penalty taking, and also he's probably most likely going to stay on for 90 minutes, which is something that we previously couldn't necessarily guarantee. He was more of a 78 to sort of 85-minute player. And so now, of course, we're looking at Alvarez a bit more short term because we also know that KDB will be back as well, probably around game weeks 20/21. And that, of course, is going to have an impact on Alvarez, as I mentioned. So the way I see it is that Julian Alvarez could be a fantastic short term punt starting from game week 17, particularly if you're taking Haaland out of your team and it's not really going to, for example, make your team a little bit more burdensome when it comes to looking at game week 18. As far as obviously Darwin and Isaac, I think they both fall as well. These are two picks who unfortunately have not delivered at all in recent weeks. Darwin, for example, we did actually expect for him to be benched in one of those fixtures. And of course, it's not nice to see that he actually got benched for Sheffield United home. In a fixture, or Sheffield United away rather, in a fixture where he actually did seem to look really good coming off the bench. However, Crystal Palace was the complete opposite of that. Although I would also recognize that ultimately Liverpool were not that effectual versus Crystal Palace. I think even Salah was a bit fortunate to really have a 1 goal, 1 assist game in that specific circumstance. But that's the sort of benefit you get when you're Salah and you're able to take shots and you play 90 minutes. Darwin doesn't get that luxury until maybe, for example, the Asian Cup happens or the AFCON. My concern with Darwin, as I said, is it really depends on the Europa League fixture. If he doesn't start, then I think he's probably nailed on for a Man United start. However, the issue, of course, is he could very well start in the Europa, maybe because, let's say, Gakpo could be prioritized for the United game. And that, of course, would have a huge impact on Darwin as a pick and as a punt. And with Isaac, of course, the issue with Wilson coming back, Champions League, EFL Cup, all those sort of things adding towards, for example, potential situations where he can substitute, it just makes it worse for me. As far as the defender cheat sheet here, we have so many changes this week, and a lot of changes, particularly in that 4.x position, where I think right now we have a lot of diversity in the position, and ultimately it's a question of, whether you should actually move towards 4 to 5 defenders who are rotating right now, as opposed to owning 3 people. Because I think, unless you, let's say, own Trent and Trippier and options like that, who, of course, Trippier is suspended anyways, it's very hard to actually own just 3 defenders at the 4.x to 5.x price point and think that can actually hold really well for this FPL period. In my opinion, you need at least 4 defenders who can actually rotate with each other, cover each other's bad fixtures, and actually be positive, for your FPL team. In terms of the 4.x position, just starting off there, I think Colwell gets a rise because of the Reece James injury. It's as simple as that because, of course, with James being out, it just means that Colwell's minutes are that much more nailed on. The issue, of course, is Gusto is back in training, so it is very possible that you could play Cucurella and Gusto. But I also tend to think that that's such a weak defensive structure that I really struggle to believe that Pochettino will actually employ Cucurella and Gusto within a defensive team. So I do think Colwell's minutes are very, very good and secure. Branthwaite is suspended. Mikolenko is a new option just due to Everton being so good. I also think, of course, if you're looking at an option like Branthwaite and you actually want an Everton defender, the issue, of course, with Branthwaite is that he is suspended. But versus Burnley away, you could very easily get Mikolenko instead. Probably get you an asset who ultimately has been taking a lot of shots this season. He's less of the sort of attacking fullback type who's more creative through the crosses, things like that. He actually inverts more often than not and actually takes a lot of goal scoring shots, which is why Mikolenko has been quite interesting. However, of course, if you just want to jump on that Everton asset, as I said, Mikolenko would be that cover. Robinson is an interesting one. I've actually given him a rise. My previous concern with him, as stated, was actually the 4 yellow cards. And I didn't have Tim Ream on the cheat sheet. And it's interesting to see, of course, he's been taken out of the team. Because I actually thought that it would be very likely that Tosin Adarabioyo would actually come in and actually take his spot. And that's actually happened. Fulham have gotten 2 clean sheets so far. But I do like Robinson. If you can get away from that sort of suspension issue, hopefully if he doesn't get suspended in game week 17, that just makes him even more better as an option in game week 18 as a fullback option for Fulham. So I would say maybe hold caution on the Fulham defender transfer and actually wait for game week 18 instead to bring them in. As far as, let's say, other options like Tsimikas and Pinnock, I think these fall just due to the declining minutes for Tsimikas and Pinnock with poor fixtures. Senesi and Dawson are new options, really just differential options for game week 18. And then with Virgil, he actually gets a fall ultimately because I still think that Trent completely trumps him from the attacking point of view, and Virgil, in my opinion, is still a little bit too expensive. In terms of the goalkeepers, we're looking at Turner being added back. However, I don't think his minutes are nailed. Areola, Dubravka, Sanchez, Johnstone, all with concerns. And then Flecken and Sanchez also just getting falls just simply because with Sanchez, as I said, there's an injury concern, and with Flecken, Brentford have looked pretty terrible and don't have the double game week, and that's going to be it for the cheat sheet. So thank you guys so much for watching. See you guys in the next video, and take care.